Sometimes I get questions from listeners, and this one's from my own community. If you write me a good question, and I'll use it to talk about on the show here. Um, and we're going to talk about democracy, sortition, and other dreams, or what we might call what was democracy before liberalism, or what was liberalism before the development of bourgeois culture. Are you um, Now you might go, Varn, what the hell are you talking about? You're talking about ancient Athens again. That was a slave state. And you're right. And also, when we study democracy, you should not limit yourself to the well-tried European examples. But we do have to talk about some things from those early Democratic and Republican experiments that are either happening very early in the development of European liberal society, which we all live through today, or later. Now, Julian wrote me, and I'm going to leave it there. We're going to redact his last name. And I'm going to say he's from an unnamed country in Europe. And he asked me about sortition because it used to come up on the show a lot more. I talked about it in regards to Paul Cockshot's early work towards the New Socialism, I think, where he talked about sortition as a way to get systems more democratic. And I also talked about Paul Cockshot's critique of Mike McNair's revolutionary strategy, where he talked about sortition was probably in some ways better than republicanism in a way to actually build a responsive political body that would be engaged and knowledgeable, because after all, you'd have to be prepared to be trained on any number of things that you might have to do. I'm going to read the letter at hand, slightly redacted, so that Julian's political affiliations and whatnot are not as clear. But I do want to talk about this and then go through a little bit of the history of this concept and why I don't talk about it as much anymore, even though I do think it's somewhat important. So let's get to my windows here. Now, and remember, I have slightly edited this, but it is mostly the original letter. I'll just read the whole thing to you. Hello, Derick. I've been listening to your stuff for at least 8 years now. So that would be before Varn Vlog. That would be probably back when I was doing, 8 years would have been symptomatic redness. And the early parts of Mortal Science, and a few other projects, both some associated with Zero Books, some not. It's just all over the place, really, since you do so many collabs, especially the Emancipation Network. The Emancipation Network was a project founded by me and one of the people who were involved with Swanside Chats that I knew from this political venture called the Red Party that was part of the Proto-Marxist Center in like 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. Didn't last long. It collapsed before even the Marxist Center was inaugurated. And now that the Marxist Center is gone and the base building tendency is kind of gone, I'll go back to explorations of that eventually. It feels weird to talk about that time period. I was interested in the Emancipation Network as someone between worlds who was very interested in Mike McNair and the Weekly Worker's critiques of left-wing unity strategies in Britain, and the revolutionary strategy book by Mike McNair was very important to me. It's also important to a lot of people that I think they took the wrong lesson from it. Like some of the people around the Cliffite organizations who became involved with the DSA. But it's vital to the formation of Cosmonaut Magazine as a project and the Marxist Unity Group and the DSA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Emancipation Project kind of happened parallel to that because we had more strongly communization and cancel communists tendencies within the group. I was probably the most normal Marxist in the Emancipation Network. And it had emerged out of podcasts that had conglomerated together, and out of projects that had conglomerated together. It included From Alpha to Omega, which was Tom O'Brien's podcast, which had been largely about MMT and ecology, and then got more and more into Marxism, and had paralleled a development of the early diet soap and the early aught teens with Doug Lane, someone I don't have a lot of good things to say about. Well, the Emancipation Network kind of fell apart, but for a while we were a collective of podcasts. We originally were going to be a collective producing a magazine. The magazine fell apart, and it was an interesting project. I did a podcast for them in addition to doing Varn Vlog, called Mortal Science. I was a guest on General Intellect Unit, the cybernetic and Marxist podcast that came on the show, and I regularly dialogued with Tom O'Brien From Alpha to America, Alpha to Omega, which I had done. I think I first started talking to Tom as early as 2012. Now, that fell apart. The tensions between Tom and I, both personal and political, became exacerbated, largely because of his antipathy towards Doug Lane. I also developed an antipathy towards Doug Lane, but I kind of had a pox on all their houses response to all of it. And Esri, the co-founder, initially led a bunch of people into the project that I didn't really know, without voting, and I was kind of slightly bitter about that. But basically, I wanted to reconcile with the people over at Cosmonaut, because there have been tensions between Emancipation Network members and myself, and that forced a full break. Between that and my break with Tom O'Brien, eventually the Emancipation Network kind of collapsed. I'm sure Tom's still doing his work and working on his work on applying Jan Appel and the Council of Communists things. I know he was working on a book with some other thinkers in the Isles about this. I wish them well. But I think General Intellect Unit wound down during the Biden years. Nonetheless, it was a project I was involved with. It was very left communist adjacent and very interested in cybernetic theory, as well as interested in council communism, etc. I had kind of moved away from all that, but it had me engage with, we read so many different things over in that project. It was an educational project. It was interesting. Anyway, Julian says, that was such an amazing project while it lasted. I think it lasted about, it lasted about 5 years. There was one thing that struck me since I listened to it 5 years ago. In the final episodes, the later half of 40 and 41 of the Revolutionary Strategy series, you guys discussed the Sortition part of Cockshot's critique of Mike McNair. I'm adding the Mike McNair part. Revolutionary Strategy series, you guys discussed the Sortition part of Cockshot's critique. Up to that point, I'd only ever heard about it as one of the slightly crackpot liberal reform ideas. No, it was used in parts of the Soviet Union. All of you were basically in agreement about how this opposition of democracy versus republicanism and how the Aristotelian view that elections are aristocratic is not really addressed by the left at all. I still don't think it's addressed by the left, because there's a tendency of representative democracy to allow oligarchies to form, which can have an aristocratic notion tied into it. And maybe you believe in like natural aristocracy emerging from the class or whatever, but you have to make that kind of argument, that Jeffersonian argument that would not also have a lot of space on the left today anyway. It might be a blind spot worth exploring further. Yeah, it is, and I'll talk about why after I read the rest of this. Sorry, I'm giving so much background content. It's important to know where this comes from. You remarked that Marx sounds more and more like the Athenian democrat the older he gets, which I totally agree, but he doesn't seem to go all the way. Maybe this is because of his Epicureanism, which I don't fully grasp. Look, I have studied Epicurus and Marx forever, and I've even talked to Christoph Seringa about this, and I don't really grasp it either. The episode's coming out. Um, Maybe I'm just projecting, but to me, you all came across as interested in the topic, so I totally expected someone to pick it up again eventually, but of course, it's never happened. Well, it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. One is I am not totally convinced that you don't need some kind of Republican transition to more direct democracy, and that's small r Republican. I am also not totally convinced that there aren't some problems with sortition, but I do think it's one of the panoply of strategies you could use, and that liberals trying to use it aren't totally wrong. It's in their political tradition going all the way back. And it has been used successfully in relatively complicated societies. Um, but the other reason why we didn't get into it is we got more and more into cybernetic structuring of systems and how we would lay out a system. And we started figuring out we need to understand systems better before we just plop sortition as a sorting mechanism into it. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about in terms of sortition, we do use sortition in the United States. It's how we pick jurors. It is considered a method of both direct and deliberative democracy, where you randomly take people and put them in roles uh, that have pretty important consequences, where citizens are empowered to form advisory groups or even do certain technical roles in society. So I had even flirted with it as a way to even get around the iron law of oligarchy by both establishing something like a cordona system as used in Chile, with sortition as a means of getting people to give inputs into the overall structure, in addition to like councils and anything else. I still think political parties should often use sortition and not just election for how they decide who gets things. Sometimes they should just be appointed by lottery. And I think that system would be just as good as making sure your members are skilled as only having the ambitious within your system run for it. But anyway, if I remember correctly, over the years, both you and Tom sometimes mentioned sortition as a suitable tool for decision making in a future society. Yeah, I did. I actually think a lot of managerial positions should be decided by sortition. Okay, sure. But what about its revolutionary potential? To quote McNair, quote, the present task of communist socialists is therefore to build an alternative opposition, one which commits itself unambiguously to the self-emancipation of the working class through extreme democracy. Like I said, this topic struck with me. I read some stuff about sortition, ancient Greece, the founding fathers, etc., and I've been wondering about whether sortition with actual decision-making power, not just stimulation of participation we get in contemporary government-sponsored citizens assemblies, which is another thing we often use sortition for. We just, basically randomly create a focus group to advise legislatures and ignore them, would actually be incompatible with capitalism. It's the split between the citoyen, that's citizen in French, proof that our writer here is European, and the bourgeois is not mediated anymore by electoralism. Would that not lay bare the contradictions of capitalism and force everyday people to grapple with it? I'm not sure it would. I'm not sure that the primary contradiction of capitalism is its lack of democracy. I think the primary opposition to capitalism is that you can have as much democracy and formal equity that you want, but the reality of the situation is that in bourgeois rule, accumulation dominates all, and you actually have a more unequal society at this point than you did under feudal systems. Would sortition help with that? Probably, because it would prove, the limitations of the way we do work. That a lot of the expertise and like CEOs and all that actually is fake. Um, But figuring out when expertise is needed and when it isn't is a problem. I mean, even in the DSA, I've often argued that the DSA has too much staff. I don't mean that they shouldn't hire people, but staffing is professional and thus outside of the realm of political. But for people who argue, as many DSAers do, as I do in the DSA too, um, that you should not be having a separate sphere of autocracy in the workforce. Why would you have a technocratic workforce that is not subject to political whims that serves you, while you have elected officials? I would much rather have elections for the professionals that we have involved, or even pick them from membership randomly by lottery. And this strikes most DSAers as insane. But I often have pointed out that they're replicating the structures of the society that they um, are trying to undo in the very structure of professional staff versus elected cadre staff in the organization. And that this even represents not just a capitalist turn, but specifically a neoliberal turn as a professionalization of large parts of the government and the administrative apparatus has been a way to remove it from democratic decision making, period, either through sortition or otherwise. So there is a way in which I think it would lay it out, but would it lay it out enough to make it clear that capitalism is the problem? I don't think so, because it came up historically in Venice and Florence, two of the proto capitalist republics. So you have that. It also was discussed during the founding of the United States, and we use it for certain things like jury duty. But anyway, in other words, would it make sense as a communist to build an alternative opposition that is solely focused on extreme democracy without any Marxist critique of capitalism? No, I think that's dishonest. I know why people want to do it, because you don't have the baggage of the historical Marxist states, but I think it's dishonest to say that we're going to just offer extreme democracy as a way out of dealing with socialism and the Marxist critique of capitalism, because why would you want to avoid that? I mean, if you want to avoid it because of its history, then you're also saying I basically, don't want to deal with historical Marxism, period. All right. The idea with it would just be an easier sell and fits right in with the mainstream because everyone does anti-politics and talks about saving democracy anyway. The thing is, everyone talks about saving democracy, but often what they're saving with democracy is republicanism. I mean, if you think about what liberals have used to talk about democracy for, even more radical ones, it's often to save the administrative state. Like, why the hell do I care about that? I mean, I do care that there's an administrative state. There will always be an administrative state. I do not care that it is professionalized and outside of the realms of politics. Like, yes, it is horrible when people's life gets busted up by their professions being ended, even when they work for the government. I work for a city. I get it. My point is that in a society where this is not just about your survival and dependency on your role in production, or in this case, the administration of social reproduction, which is what a lot of this stuff actually is in the state, then that impetus to feel bad about professionals goes away, and we can treat it more democratically and politically. And if there is kinds of expertise that you really need, we can allow that. We can figure out where the cooks can govern and where we actually need experts, because you need both, probably. So why go with the easier sell? Because saving democracy might sound good, but most people don't know what they mean by it anyhow. And a lot of what people associate with democracy is actually liberal technocracy, which is why there's an anti-democratic sentiment right now. I mean, one of the things that's so ironic today is there's a lot of anti-democratic populism. I'm not a lover of populism, but this anti-populist rhetoric from liberals is hilarious to me. That has turned on democratic inputs because they see them as anti-democratic, and they're not wrong. And yet both sides ultimately rely on this. In America, the Republicans rely on conservatism as a rule of the morally better. Um, so that there's a Republican stopgap against the hoi polloi. And then um in liberal circles, you have the technocratic stopgap where the directive of society is decided by democratic means and the hoi polloi is okay, but the administration of that directive cannot be allowed to be decided upon by the general public. Well, we can see that both of these allow for elite capture all over the place. And you might go, okay, well, that's an argument for sortition, but is it though? I mean, because the problem is, yes, I'm arguing for sortition, but sortition for what? We already have certain elements of sortition in our society. If you want it to be meaningful, you have to actually pull it off. All right. It would be like an injection of class consciousness through the back door. I tend to agree with Marxist critique of Gaudet. You shouldn't try to infuse class consciousness to the back door because a lot of these reforms would fail and then people would see you as pushing something that you think would not work, which people rightly recognize is dishonest. All right. And on the other hand, that might even be counterproductive because these conditions, sortition would only serve to stabilize and legitimize capitalist rule. Sometimes, if they stabilize it, I mean, right now it could. I've actually thought about this when people push for worker co-ops. I've thought about this when people want to move away from co-management, which is what everybody on the worker left argues today, to something like syndicalism. I think syndicalism is insufficient and would still be capitalist. A very, very contentious argument that I have with anarchists, but at least it would get the incentives together. Right now, the opposition between the firms and the business, because the business is trying to extract money to the firms. Excuse me. The opposition between not the firms, the opposition between the business end of the firms and the worker end of the firms is further solidified in code management and collective bargaining. And the code management element means that one, the militancy of the workers actually has to be partially stamped down by the union. They want that militancy, but they also want to prove they can control it. Otherwise, the logic of the contract doesn't make sense. And two, there's a lot of times where workers would want things that were objectively bad for the survival of the firm because they're against the business interest of private accumulation. It would be better if the decisions of the firm's accumulation were also decided by the people doing the work. Therefore, they could figure out the trade-offs they would need to make between their own enrichment and the enrichment of others. And that's in a capitalist co-op system. That would be good, but it isn't socialism by any stretch of the imagination, by my definition. Now, all these words have variable meanings. We could have semantic debates about socialism all day. But my point is, co-op isn't good enough, but it would actually be useful as a way of teaching people how to deal with collective planning, how to make those kinds of decisions, etc. And so would sortition in general society. But it may actually prolong capitalism. I don't think we can know one way or the other. Any gambit would be theoretical. Okay. Up until recently, this was merely some theoretical speculation on my part, but a few months ago, some philosopher guy on YouTube I've been low-key following founded a sortition party that's very much not communist, but aims to be big tent and nonpartisan. Any political party that aims to be nonpartisan is actually trying not to be a party. I know what you mean by it. You mean non-super ideological, but like a party works by being partisan. This is why those two words are related etymologically in English. All right. Why aggressively antagonizing all of the parties with the single goal to reform the Constitution along sortition lines. A surprisingly good match for what I had dreamed up, as well as outrageously ambitious. Sure, I joined just to see where things would go. No, we don't know where this party is, and I'm going to tell you. So I'm faced with the choice on whether to invest time to do grunt work with a bunch of fumbling liberals. I totally accept the risk that it might go nowhere, deform into some weird sect or whatever, but I feel like I'm missing the theoretical background to roughly judge whether the overall idea is actually a worthwhile endeavor or not. So I don't know. You have any opinion on this? It is not like I want to ask Sensei Barn to make life choices for me for anything good. I will not help you on that. But I just yearn for some theoretical input. There seems like there's none to be had, and I don't want to check out for 3 years to read books. So asking someone insanely erudite seems like a prudent thing to do. And oh yeah, I feel inclined to do an episode about the revolutionary potential of sortition or whatever. That would of course be amazing, which we're kind of doing right now. Best regards, Julian. So to address Julian's question, it's worth trying, but with a low fuse of when you would exit. All right. Now, the danger is when you do that, you're also drinking the Kool-Aid, and there's a way in which you can convince yourself of things that you know better than. I've seen people do it all the time. But to ask yourself a question, can we push for this reform in society? I think it might be a good thing to do, but knowing a couple of problems. One, it's going to, since it is dealing in the realm of partisan politics in the nation state, it will necessarily be nation bound, which means its limits for how you coordinate with socialists is going to be a problem. The national question is kind of the bugbear and what socialists forever get stuck for good reason. I don't think it's easily avoided. I don't think you can just throw it out, but it's something to think about. Two, sortition would not lead to a socialist society any more than democracy has led to democratic society, because people can compartmentalize parts of private affairs outside of the realm of government, which would mean they would also probably apply that same compartmentalization to work, since they would see it as a private affair, in which case you would replicate the same problems that you have in liberalism. You've had formal, even if politically valuable, sortition that might help liberal governments even function and for the better, and that might be good. There's no reason not to do that. But it would not lead to anything like socialism just by radicalizing democracy. Nor do I think everything should be done by sortition. But let's just talk about the history of sortition for those who don't know it. Selection by lot, which was called isonomia, selection by Athenian democracy was developed in the 6th century. Okay. I just said selection by lot was called iconomia. Isonomia was equality of the law and political rights, but it was only equality for citizens. And this means equal rights are equal by custom and law. It was a word used by Herodotus and Thucydides to refer to kinds of popular governments. And it's been used by both leftists and rightists as a concept. Friedrich Hayek used it in the Constitution for Liberty. It has all kinds of usage on both the left and the right. Hannah Arendt used it. But you will notice Marxists don't tend to use it because we don't think it actually exists. We don't think isonomia existed, even in ancient Greece, because class society means equal rights is formally impossible and must remain, as Marx says in the Goethe critique, is basically something that exists only on paper in the minds of liberals. Because if you can buy more, you have more actual rights. So equality before the law can only be equality in abstract. Abstract, removed from your social situation, and thus not actually applicable to daily life. So sortition was considered to be democratic. In fact, sortition was considered to be more democratic than elections. And it makes sense because it means that literally anyone can end up in certain positions. There were complex procedures with allotment machines that were built that were supposed to be used to avoid oligarchs developing to buy their office. And this was a constant problem in a lot of these early democratic societies, just like it is now. We just let people buy their office, but the ancient Greeks actually did try to think about it. Most of the ancient Greek writers that you read, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles, Herodotus, all mention sortition as one of the building blocks of democracy, not just election. So they thought that it was more democratic than elections, and this was why some people condemned it. Um, Particularly Socrates was worried his randomly selected decision makers had enough expertise than like philosopher kings. But since he was a philosopher, it seems interesting that he would come up with that. Now, we kind of lost this element of democracy. Um, so magistrates were decided by lot. Anyone who was over the age of 30, who was not disenfranchised, uh, for whatever reason, could serve in this. Now, I find that interesting because it means that there is a way which you're going to get input from all society, and you have to deal with that. There's also like examinations of those selected by lot, so you could be disqualified if you were assumed to be completely incompetent. You didn't have a good enough character. You didn't have the property things, which is a source the socialists wouldn't worry about. Um, if you were insane, they did rule this out. And magistrates were monitored by the General Assembly, which was elected, and they had to render accounts of their office all the time. In fact, any citizen could also request a suspension of a magistrate for due reason, and that would be brought to the assembly and it would be voted on. So recall was very much part of this. This was used for jury duty. This was used for magistrates, etc. So it'd be like if we appointed the head of DHS by some random wine mom in Wisconsin got it. You just don't know. There's a lot of studies that said that Athenians actually really did trust the system of random selection, and they thought it was the simplest way to make appointments as opposed to other ways that could lead to nepotism or oligarchical capture, which is something they were very concerned with. Now, in the Western system, this was also tried in Lombardy and Venice in the 12th and 13th centuries. They were chosen randomly, had to swear an oath, and not to take bribes. And they had to be property owners or guild members or artisans. And they would be, basically government ministers. This was also used in the Venetian system for members of committees to nominate candidates for the general council. So this was how they got candidates for elections. And again, in Florence in the 14th and 15th century, this was used. While early Enlightenment thinkers actually do praise this, in fact, Montesquieu writes about it in the Spirit of Laws. We normally cite Montesquieu as where the concept of division of government comes from, which is interesting. Montesquieu supposedly based this on the British system, which is funny because the British system didn't have divisions of government, but nonetheless, Montesquieu echoed Aristotle to find elections aristocratic. Remember, Aristotle thought elections were good because they were aristocratic. Montesquieu thought that they were kind of bad, but Montesquieu actually argues that sortition would actually be good if there are tests to make sure that people who are in the pool of the lottery are competent and not corrupt, because that's always a problem with random selection too. And of course, Edmund Burke, famous liberal conservative that he was worried about this, and he thought that they would be less effective. and less productive than self-selected politicians, because self-selected politicians are motivated by their own wants. So it is in some ways this argument about self-enrichment and motivation versus civic duty as a motivator that you see in a lot of these early Enlightenment debates. And basically, like in many things, Burke's attitude won out, particularly in the American context, but also in the British, which is why sortition has had such a limited role in democracy since then. Now, believe it or not, we do have a modern example of a modern nation state doing this before the 1840s, and that is Switzerland doing parts of government by random selection to avoid corruption, particularly of the mayor. So sometimes mayors were just, picked by lot. Now, I don't know if it's going to solve most of our problems, nor do I think it inherently leads to socialism. But the idea that things that don't need scientific expertise, and most things that we have elections for don't need scientific expertise, you can look at Congress and know they don't have it, could easily just be filled randomly if you had a minimum criterion for who can sit in the lot. Like, are you literate? Now, you might say that still creates some class dynamics because you have some people shut out. But the idea, if you have universal education and property is not a criterion, then this is available to everyone. But I think this is part of the core of liberal democracy that has been abandoned over time for the atomization of the individual. These early parts of the more radical elements of liberalism from the ancient world that were reincorporated in the early modern period have largely been dropped because we, whether we admit it or not, are uncomfortable with democracy. That's always been true in America. I mean, you read the Federalist Papers, and there's some very strong anti-democratic arguments in favor of protecting the minority. Liberals like to seize on Madison's writings about that as if he was talking about protecting minorities like the oppressed or racial minorities or the indigenous people. But honestly, who he was specifically talking about was the rich, who had a feeling of the majority of the poor and thought that voters might vote their money away. And in some ways, thus the fear of socialism begins, right, in liberal society, because that stuff had already been hinted at, even in the American revolutions, myriad of philosophies and contradictions. You can kind of see it implicit in people like Thomas Paine. Now, the American Revolution is a huge contradiction in terms. Unlike other people who want to write it off as just a counter-revolution, think it is both a revolution and a counter-revolution at the same time, and depending on who you are and where you're at in it, it's a hydra. But most social movements are. The idea that you have unilaterally progressive or regressive social movements seems to me to be a Whiggish child's game. But similar with sortition, there's nothing inherently socialistic about it, except that you're saying that there should be no innate class barrier for things that don't involve like expertise that is scientific and technical. Since we allow many of these things to be picked by election, why don't we allow them to be picked by just putting random people there and have them recallable by the General Assembly, of which any citizen could do? Maybe the problem is it doesn't scale and it would lead to chaos. I mean, maybe that's your issue, but then maybe you have to think about the scales in which democracy is attempting to work at. However, I do not think pushing for sortition alone would ever be enough of a political project to, one, get people interested. I'm not sure that people understand it enough that it would automatically occur to people as radical in the first place. And two, that it isn't still so tied into nation bounds and people's distinctions in public and private that you see in democracy, small d, today, or republics today, would not still apply there in such a way to make it almost impossible to implement without having the same problems you have in representative democracy now. Even though it is increasingly clear that the government picks winners and losers in the capitalist world all the time, even the average people, as they understand the tech oligarchs kind of got rich with government contracts. Most people still think there is a private sphere of which government should not enter, and that part of that private sphere is in material production of society. They're wrong, but most people feel that way. And I don't just mean they're wrong in a normative sense. I mean they're wrong in a descriptive sense too. That like most people are anti-political because they hate the impingements of politics on their society, which I get, but that's because they think that this is fundamentally separate. It's fundamentally separate because a lot of politics is parasitic. But if we are honest, there's no way to run most societies without collectives and things that can act as agents and proxies for large groups of people, and thus governments exist. Whether or not you think they're always states, we can argue with anarchists about that, but governance, the ability of people to come together and act as agents, are to act with collective unity and organization, to act like agents, even if they are not, because collectives can't have agency, they don't have a singular brain, is probably the most important things you do in politics, and getting more voices in more places through things like sortition is a way to do it. But I don't know by itself that it would be a powerful enough reform to push the consciousness in the way you want to push it. And for those of you who don't know anything about the idea, there's lots of reading up on it. I'll put it here for you. Thanks, Julian, for the question. Thanks, audience, for following along. This is one of my longer solos. Lately, I've been doing shorter solos, as short as 5 minutes, because people's attention span just sucks. But I wanted to give a more full discussion of this one today. Protect your peace, people, and start thinking about what it is to live a more radically power egalitarian life. Now, asterisk. Marx was not a formal egalitarian. I talked about him being a power egalitarian, and that it is implied in the structure of communism. But he thinks like formal equality is weird, because arguing that a person who doesn't have an arm is equal to a person who does is strange, since we need to take care of the person who doesn't have an arm. We need to make provisions for them. I mean, Marx is pretty clear on that. He doesn't think like, direct labor theory value, and we should just let non-workers die because they're crippled or not of age or whatever. Excuse me, disabled. I will use a better term. But it's weird to talk about it in forms of formal equity, because in a sense, a person who doesn't have an arm really can't do things. And we might be able to do other things in compensation for that I can't do. We shouldn't try to pretend that's equality, right? But power egalitarianism, that person's opinion, the armless person, in my opinion, if we both do work, is equal. That's where Marx is at. He wouldn't have called it that. He was dealing with things in liberals. I don't know that power egalitarianism is always super clear, but it's a way to get across to people what we mean, that we're not saying everyone's the same, and that conservative canard should not, doesn't really play in what we're talking about. But yeah, we've lost something to the discussion of democracy, because most people don't understand what ancient democracy was. They focus on either its elections and its deliberative assemblies, or they focus on the fact that it was built on the backs of slavery, which is also very true. I think you have to look at all the various social arrangements that were in these democratic systems and look at why some of them would work and why some of them wouldn't, and deal with it accordingly. Anyway, protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. If you want to ask me a question, you can ask them in the show notes. I don't, bad engagement helps my algorithm scores, although I'm not monetized, so it doesn't really matter anyway. But I appreciate it. If you want more of this, Patreon exists. You can get access for a little $4, and there's reading groups and sometimes additional episodes. There's about 3 additional episodes a month, probably. You get the audio for everything, and there's some more video if you go higher, and you get more access to me if you go higher. But most people for $4 can get access to the reading groups and the audio for everything. So I think it's a good deal. But anyway, but if you don't want to subscribe, I totally understand. There's a free podcast. Free podcast can always use reviews on Spotify or Apple or whatever people are using today. And if you like, hit the comment for the algorithm. I am not monetized on YouTube. Monetized elsewhere, but I'm not monetized on YouTube. My growth is organic, which means the algorithm does not favor me. But anything you can do to show engagement would help that. So comment away. Take care. Protect your peace. And start dreaming of a better tomorrow.